Dim the lights, lie back, and let your breath find its steady, easy rhythm. Tonight we will walk slowly through a very old story, one of thunder and linen, of strength that trembles and strength that heals, so that by the end of it, sleep might come as something earned and gentle. If this tale brings you any quiet, any easing of the shoulders, consider liking the video, only if it feels right for you. There are many ways to begin a life. The poets begin at the thunderhead. The housewives will begin at the hearth. For Hercules, most of the old storytellers agree, both beginning and home came together in the dark night when gods and mortals crossed the threshold. Alcmene was of a noble line, a woman whose household kept its lamps trimmed and its linen neat. Amphitryon, the man she loved and later called husband, was a soldier returned from war. His name was the kind that made neighbors speak with a respectful nod. Zeus watched this quiet life, and, in a manner that will always make the mythic heart beat, chose to step into it. He took the shape of Amphitryon's voice and presence and entered Alcmene's bed. The night accepted him as a visitor. Dawn would bring its consequences. There is a softness to the way some tell the birth, linen warm from the hearth, the smell of oil and fresh wool, the low murmur of servants. One myth whispers that Alcmene's labor was long, that Hera, queen of the gods and jealous of Zeus's attentions, delayed the moment. Another voice in the chorus says that Galanthus, the quick-witted maid, answered Hera's design with a small, sharp deceit. She cried out as if the child had already been born, and in that instant the labor opened. In gratitude or anger, the gods did what gods do. They marked the day and stretched it with their will. Imagine the cradle, simple wood, soft cloth, the hush of a house preparing to sleep. Into that hush, small hands and small fury entered. Hera, who had the patience to wait but not the sweetness to forgive, sent danger in the shape of two serpents. They slid like cold ribbons toward the infant in his woven bed. Most children wake and cry at the first stirring threat. This child met it with something entirely his own. He grasped the serpents, and with a grip that seemed more the work of some inborn ordinance than of a nursing infant, he strangled them both. The servants who tell the tale will remember the sound of their own quick breaths, the linen falling from their hands, the sudden knowledge that this child would be different. The image lives in paint and clay as well as in words. Attic vases from the 6th century BCE sometimes show the small hero in his cradle, serpents coiled and vanquished, an icon of beginnings that are never ordinary. Such depictions do not argue literal fact, they keep a shape of meaning, strength announced at the start. Strength for Heracles would always sit beside appetite, an appetite for food, for challenge, for life. He grew large in body and large in tendency.
Tutors attempted to bring him to balance. Some taught him music, an art that softens the edges. He learned the strings and the notes, but found that his hands were more suited to other things. Others tried to teach him letters and lore. He could memorize whole lists and yet forget the gentling rule of patience. If you picture him as a boy, imagine wide palms, a face that could laugh and then go suddenly grave, a child who could lift heavy stones with the ease of taking up a bowl. There is always that tension in these early years, the teacher who sees promise and the temper that will not always be cued. Once, when a music master strained to shape him, Heracles struck out, not in malice, but in a way that spoke of an infant's impatience that had become a man's force. Linus, the name some say, fell by the young hand that would later carry burdens no one else could. Treat the old line with care. It is told to show how impulse and strength, when unguided, can make trouble out of goodwill. Youth found him moving beyond the house. The countryside of his upbringing was scrub and olive trees, goats and furtive streams that smelled faintly of iron. He learned to run across stony ground and to wrestle with animals that were not kind. Once, in the shelter of Cithaeron's hills, a wild lion, smaller than the Nemean beast but fierce enough, ran from prey to prey. The young Heracles met it, and when he returned home with a pelt over his shoulders, neighbors first laughed and then grew quiet at the sight. The skin, rough and mottled, became a sort of uniform for him, a living cloak reminding both wearer and watcher that there was a border where human did not end and myth began. There is an image I like to hold between my hands as I tell this, the house at dusk, the boy with the lion's hide at his feet, the smell of roasted barley, the soft footfall of his mother. Strength, when worn like that, looks almost unremarkable. It is human at its core,
and a little more than human at its edges. Artists would later sculpt him in marble, rendering that paradox, muscle and melancholy, in stone that absorbs light. A 3rd century BCE image softened in marble by the sculptor Lysippus and copied by Roman hands shows a man whose face carries a tired tenderness. It is worth noticing how later civilizations kept this tiredness, as if the hero's weariness was part of his honor. Not every tale of his young years ends with applause. There were follies, an appetite for wine, a blistering temper that scattered friends, a tendency to act before reflection. Once, as a young man at a banquet, mocked for his size, he grabbed a cup and smashed it. The laughter that followed turned into quarrel, as laughter often does when pride is stepped upon. These domestic scenes matter because they keep the hero close to us. He is not some untouchable warrior from impossible lands. He is a neighbor's son who ate too fast, who loved too much, who bruised his friend when a hot word fell.
Sleepable aside, imagine the long curl of a summer evening in those years. Olive leaves casting moving shadow on the courtyard wall, a dog pressing its warmth against the sleeper's ankle, a woman rocking a child under the dim of an oil lamp. The world of Hercules' youth is textured with such small comforts. They cushion the harder moments like wool beneath boarded floors. There was a marriage for him, an attempt at domesticity that promised repair and steadiness. Megara, daughter of a Theban king, came into his life as a bride. Children followed, and for a while the household might have seemed a small island of peace. That too is part of the telling. The hero accepted the ordinary duties of hearth and fatherhood and tried, in his way, to be small. But the gods have moods, and Hera's had not softened. The motif of divine jealousy, ancient, inexorable, repeats across many stories, and here it took the form of a great and quiet cruelty. Where poets are inventive, they put the cause variously. She inspired a madness that pried at his mind. She sent a fog that changed the shape of day. The details differ by teller, but the consequence is always the same. A terrible tragedy unfolded. Hercules, wrapped in a night not of his making, allowed grievous harm to enter his home. Speak this part with gentle restraint, for the old stories do not want to parade that grief. They want us to feel the quiet aftermath, the silence, the impossible weight, the empty bowls. What follows a grief like that is not merely sorrow. In the old code, there is such a thing as miasma, a spiritual pollution that stains more than the heart. The laws that governed households and cities believed that certain crimes, whether intentional or divinely induced, carried a residue that could touch others. Hercules felt it as a chill that did not lift. He sought atonement not because he was told to, but because the self presses for the washing of a stain it cannot see. So he went to Delphi. But before he reached the oracle, let us pause at another small picture that these legends keep returning to: Hercules as a traveler through the night. Roads in Greece are not merely stone and dirt, they are breathing things in the poetry. The plain exhales, the hills gather their skirts, and the sea whispers down toward the cities. Walking, he would pass little shrines where travelers had once left wine or a coin. He would sleep beneath trees that smelled faintly of resin and salt. The stars, unblinking and patient, watched him cross from one life into another. Scholarly aside, the shrine at Delphi, dedicated to Apollo, became a center for pan-Hellenic consultation by the first millennium BCE, attracting visitors from across the Mediterranean. People came seeking counsel and purification, and it is in such a place the myth places Hercules to receive an order, a shape for his penance. At Delphi, the priestess spoke in voice and song, or in riddles softened by laurel smoke. Her words shaped his future. The message, which might sound harsh to a modern ear, was for the hero to perform labors, tasks that would measure him against the world and against himself. They were not merely feats to be admired, they were ordeals meant to cleanse and to teach endurance. In the quiet between those words and the rising of the sun, a new structure took form around him, not peace at once, but a long apprenticeship in hardship and service. Imagine for a moment how such a decree lands on a man who has already known violence and longing. He is asked to take on the impossible and make it part of a new life. There is a certain comfort to that. An ordered struggle can be less heavy than a guilty silence.
The tasks, when enumerated, would sound like a litany of challenges drawn from across the earth, things wreathed in myth and purpose. But at this stage, before their full telling, they live in the imagination as shadows and soft bells, forecasts of labor and perhaps eventual rest. Between these major beats of the plot, the storytellers often insert small scenes to remind us of him in context. There is the moment of quiet humor when he accepts a stolen meal from a poor household, or the time he is made a tutor to a youth and confesses clumsily at the end of the lesson that he could not teach gentleness that was not already in the boy. These moments are the salt in the stew. Without them, the hero would be all bronze and no bread. Lullaby passage. Think of a simple room, a narrow bed, a cup of warm water, a window where moonlight pools. Imagine that the day's weight slides slowly from your shoulders into the floorboards, and there is nothing left of it on your skin. The breath that settles in your chest is slow. It carries images of quiet streets and small lamps. Let that breath hold you for a moment. Let the steady sound of it be the world's answer to the day's alarms. There were other companions along his path. Athena, who admired cleverness and offered counsel like a steady hand, crossed his way in those years. Apollo, whose domain is both song and clarity, was present in the shrines that guided him. Even those gods who had set trials before him sometimes offered small mercies, a weapon that fit his hand, a word of warning, an idea for a solution. Myth keeps the balance between rivalry and assistance, as if the world that presses upon the human is made of both. A detail worth hearing, soft and small. Some tellers say Hercules once served a king as a humble laborer, put under the yoke not as punishment but as discipline. In Lydia, tradition says, he became close to a household of foreigners and learned manners and the economy of patience. These anecdotes do not seek to aggrandize him, they aim to humanize. Strength, when tested, becomes a teacher of small practices: how to rise at dawn, how to braid rope, how to thank the baker. Art keeps these casual moments with the same tenderness as the great feats.
In Roman villas, frescoes show him at the table with a pitcher, smiling at cats or children. In Hellenistic small bronzes, he appears talking with friends. Culture, when it borrows a hero, often wants him at the hearth in the end. Sooner or later, the path returns to those heavier matters, the public tasks that would define his long years. But before that great arc unfolds, there is an urgency in the quieter episodes, those days when travel is long and the mind finds itself reciting past sorrows like beads. In one such evening, he stood at a small spring, watching the water make circles around the stones, and thought of the children who no longer called him father. The memory struck like a cold hand. Yet even in that frost there was a seed, the knowledge that to be cleansed he would have to move, to act, to meet the world's stubbornness with his own stubbornness. Another lullaby paragraph. Picture an open field at twilight. The air tastes of hay and far-off rain. Fireflies lift like tiny lanterns, indifferent to human sorrow. Let your heart slow as if it were one of their lights, small and patient. There is no urgency here, only the gentle law of night pressing everything into rest. There is a tenderness to remembering his laughter in the taverns tucked into the roadsides. Travelers swapped stories there, old women who would print each hero's misdeeds into a moral, sailors who loved the sound of a strong man's accent, children who left out bread in the hopes of seeing him again. His legend, even in those early days after Delphi, was not wholly grave. It carried a wryness. Hercules could be clumsy in love, awkward in etiquette, generous to a fault at feasts. These particulars remind us that the hero wears a human skin. Scholarly aside, Roman poets such as Ovid and later Hellenistic writers took different stances on these episodes, sometimes embellishing them with comic detail, sometimes austerely moralizing. Their versions circulated widely, shaping how art and theater later reimagined the man. There is a tenderness to remembering his laughter in the taverns tucked into the roadsides. Travelers swapped stories there, old women who would print each hero's misdeeds into a moral, sailors who loved the sound of a strong man's accent, children who left out bread in the hopes of seeing him again. His legend, even in those early days after Delphi, was not wholly grave. It carried a wryness. Hercules can be clumsy in love, awkward in etiquette, generous to a fault at feasts. These particulars remind us that the hero wears a human skin. There is within the myth a quiet pedagogy.
Trials are less about proving innate superiority than about teaching a way through the world. The early deaths that marked him, or the harm he unwittingly caused, become, in mythic logic, the pressure that forges a better metal. This idea is not a consolation for suffering. It is a thought the stories press into the ear. Endurance can be a teacher, not merely a burden. In the months after Delphi's decree, Heracles' movement took on a new rhythm. He prepared where he could, sought counsel where it was offered, and walked across lands that kept the memory of him as both a friend and a threat. Towns felt the hush when a giant of a man entered their market. Women folded their laundry, men paused in their work, and children followed at a safe distance to watch what would happen next. It is a strange sensation to be both feared and beloved. It is sometimes a lonely place to be.
Yet loneliness has its own discipline. In the small hours when wind moves through olive boughs and the sour scent of citrons drifts from a garden wall, he would practice tasks that seemed foolish to an onlooker, making a knot again and again until it would never slip, whittling a piece of wood until his hands remembered gentleness, counting steps between stones so as to remember each day by measure. These acts are the hidden labor of the labors themselves, the private rehearsals of a life that must be lived both in public spectacle and in secret patience. Slowly, inexorably, the shape of his forthcoming service took hold. It would be measured not only by beasts vanquished, but by the places his path would take him, forests that smelled of sap, rivers that cut between stones with a sound like glass, palaces whose courtyards were paved with the histories of other men. There is a comforting image for the tired listener in that itinerary, the idea that the world itself can be a teacher, that each landscape offers its own lesson in how to carry weight. As the days stretched and the first orders, or perhaps invitations, took form, he learned another valuable thing: how to accept help. Even the strongest need counsel at times. Friends and gods both gave him plans. Athena's advice often came as a small piece of strategy: where to stand, which weakness to look for. Apollo's temple offered a clarity that cut away the clutter of shame. Taking instruction required humility, and humility, in these tales, is not a small thing. In the hush before one of his first recorded trials, though the word trial seems too heavy for those preliminary acts, he sat upon a stone by a roadside and quietly mended a tear in the leather of his sandal. The action itself had no grand audience. It required a needle, patient fingers, the soft smell of oil. There was a kind of providence in this small mending, a reminder that great deeds proceed from small, careful tasks, from the slow repair of things that are worn. We close this part of his life with that image, sitting by the road as evening folds, hands busy with a needle and thread. It is a picture of ordinary attention. It holds the weight of distant thunder and quiet home fires alike. He was a man summoned to feats that would be sung and sculpted across centuries, and yet at this small moment he repairs what is broken with a simple, methodical piece. From here, the path bends toward the formal ordering of his service, toward the labors that will test the breadth of his body and the depth of his heart. We will meet them in due time, each set like a bead on a string, each with its own place and lesson. For now, allow the image of mended leather and evening air to settle. Let it be a small harbor in the longer voyage to come. The first of the tasks came like a bell that rings at dusk, clear, unavoidable.
Eurystheus, the king who had been placed by fate as judge and witness, named the labors one by one, and each name sat in the air like a pebble dropped into a quiet pool. The small ripples told him what to do. The rhythm of his journey would now be marked by a list. The Nemean lion was the first upon that list. It lived, the old stories say, in a hollow of rock where the wind kept its patience. The countryside around Nemea smelled of thyme and hot stone. Farmers kept their children close when the animal came down from its den. Its pelt was said to be thick as a shield, its roar a low drum that set hounds to skittishness. Heracles tracked the creature gently at first, moving as a hunter who wished to avoid upsetting nests. He watched the lion drink from shaded pools, noted the beat of its chest, the way the morning sun reduced its mane to a halo. Then, when the moment shaped itself like a tide, he met it not with a spear, but with his hands, those hands that had first gripped serpents in a cradle. There was, in the telling, a long and quiet struggle, arms around an animal that was more force than fury, a compressing of breath and motion until the beast stilled. The important thing the storytellers linger on is not the contest, but the transformation that followed. Heracles skinned the lion, not to parade its hide in triumph, but to wear it as a reminder that what is hardest to face sometimes becomes the cloak by which we remember the day we learned to stand. Soft aside. Artists often render this moment in relief and marble, showing a man with the head of the lion perched over his own, as if he had borrowed an animal's dignity to cover his vulnerability. Such images were meant to comfort as much as awe, a picture of protection more than conquest. The second labor woke like a darkening pond, the Lernaean hydra. It lived in a swamp where reeds whispered, and the air smelled of rot and sweetness. Its heads, myth says, multiplied when cut. It was a creature of persistent trouble, the sort that would not be solved by strength alone. Heracles approached with companions, and when one struck, the wound birthed two more. It was then that he learned the value of method, of not only force, but of a mind that held a thread. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, who in many tellings is a quiet correction to haste, Heracles cauterized the stumps after each decapitation so that new heads could not rise. The image is patient rather than bloody. One hand holds the creature at bay, while another runs a slow torch, breath measured, fingers steady. The final immortal head was driven deep and buried beneath a weight of stone, a gesture of containment rather than annihilation. The story places a soft lesson here. Some troubles repeat, and repeated actions can be the way we learn to close the same wound again and again. Lullaby passage. Imagine, after such a hard night, the quiet sound of a brook being mended.
Little stones laid by careful fingers, water finding a new, gentle path. There is a lesson in that slow repair. Let your thoughts follow a small current, round and deliberate. Your breath is the hand that smooths the stones. The third task moved him into a gentler landscape, the Serenian hind, a deer with antlers of bronze and hooves that barely touched the grass. It belonged to Artemis, goddess of wild places, and to take it required tact more than force. Heracles followed it for a year, learning the patience of tracking something that seems to shy away from the world's noise. When he finally caught sight of it, it stood like a bell among reeds, eyes like quiet mirrors. He did not chase and maim, he captured gently, binding it with words as much as with rope, and brought it back alive to show that sometimes a labor asks not for killing, but for careful care. Scholarly aside, in vase paintings this scene appears with a bow hung idle, as if the artist wanted us to remember restraint as a kind of bravery. The Erymanthian boar came next, coarse breath steaming on cold mornings, a beast that rooted and overturned. Valleys closed around its path like a slow trap. Heracles sent nets and feints. He drove the animal through snow and toward a cliff's gentled slope where it could be slowed and bound without unnecessary bloodshed. There is a comic lightness in some tellings. The hero returns, the boar snuffled at his feet, and he is scolded by Eurystheus, who hides from the sight of it in a jar, embarrassed by the living danger brought close to his threshold. The story likes such small human pauses. Kings hiding from beasts is a soft comic detail in a serious arc. Between these labors, a lullaby paragraph. Picture a lane of cypress trees at dusk, the air cool against your skin. Each branch seems to tell a small secret, a memory of a hand that knotted a rope, the imprint of a foot on soft ground. Let your shoulders drop. The world, like the trees, will hold its place while you breathe. The fifth labor, perhaps the one that asks the most for a symbolic pause, is the cleaning of the Augean stables. King Augeas possessed herds so large that their sheltering barnrooms had become islands of muck. The task ascribed to Heracles was not to fight a beast so much as to face the long accumulation of neglect. Where men had made excuses, he found a river and redirected its course, letting water carry away what had been denied for years. The act is not only clever, it is a parable about changing the flow rather than scrubbing forever. It says, sometimes a single redirection of attention can cleanse what seemed permanently stained. Art vignette. Later painters would show Heracles standing at the bank as water takes the filth, a quiet silhouette bent like someone turning a key. The scene comforts because it shows a problem solved by a small change, not by endless scrubbing.
The Stymphalian birds were a clangor of beaks and wing and metal, creatures that fell from the sky like a bad dream and pecked at fields and flesh alike. Heracles could not simply run them down. Athena supplied him with a rattle, an instrument that created a sound like a summer thunderhead. He used it to startle them into motion, and in the noise he found an opening. Arrows and nets took the creatures without close pursuit, and the sky cleared. The takeaway is patient. Sometimes the way to clear the air is to make a sound that bids the trouble move on. Another lullaby paragraph.
Remember a night when wind moves through shutters, making the house speak softly. That sound is not alarm, it is the body's language of settling. Let your mind become that slow shutter, opening and closing without fight. The Cretan bull was a beast sent from a god, a creature whose presence smelled of salt and tide. Hercules sailed to Crete, where the bull roamed along the cliffs and stared out to sea. He took it by the neck with a tenderness that surprises. There is a gentle patience to his hand as he guides the animal onto a ship and brings it back to Eurystheus. On the sea, the beast was both wild and resigned. The hero's control was not mere dominance, but a shepherding across the wide water. The images of him on a small deck with a great animal, the waves a slow rocking cradle, have the quietness of an ocean voyage. Interlude. Think of a small boat at night, lantern dim, the seas slow breathing like an old work of craft. Let your thought rock in that rhythm, a tiny vessel finding its lane. The mares of Diomedes were famous for a feral hunger. They were said to feed on flesh, a mythic exaggeration that speaks to a chaos of appetite. Heracles came, and instead of slaying them outright, he found a way to soothe them, either by trick or by feeding their master to them in some versions. But in gentler tellings, he harnesses their restlessness with quiet measures, bringing them under yoke and sending them across seas. The legibility of the tale lies in the idea that appetite can be trained. What seems ravenous can be refashioned into labor that serves others. Short lullaby passage. Imagine horses at a low stable, breathing like slow drums. Their ears flick, then settle. The smell of straw is soft and familiar. Let the slow inhale and exhale of a sleeping animal be the measure of your own breath. The belt of Hippolyta was a labor that moves into territory of negotiation. Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, wore a belt given as honor, and to fetch it, Heracles had to travel not only across seas, but into a culture that honored different rules. In some tales, he is welcomed and given the belt with courtesy. In others, trick and misunderstanding turn peace into conflict. The scene speaks to the difficulty of crossing worlds with respect. The lesson is that some honors are not taken by force, but earned through cautious diplomacy. Strength alone cannot claim every prize.
And artwork aside, vase painters sometimes depict Hippolyta not as an enemy, but as a woman of dignity, her face composed under a diadem, an image that invites us to consider the human figure behind the title Queen. The journey to Gerion's cattle carried him to the edge of the known world, a place where the light feels thin and the air a long, cold clarity. Gerion himself is depicted as a remote lord of a strange island, and his herd grazed on cliffs. Heracles crossed deserts and sea, battled a two-headed dog, and then used cunning to take the cattle. He brought them home not as trophies, but as proof that a man can travel far and return bearing what is difficult to carry. The tale softens the idea of possession into one of witness. He had seen the distant land and learned its way. He returned in better knowledge. Lullaby paragraph. Picture a low, high plain at dusk, with the sky a thin bowl above it. The horizon hums in blue. Let your awareness expand to that wide, calm openness, and feel the smallness of tight worry within it. The apples of the Hesperides are perhaps the most mythic of the labors in tone. These apples, fruits that grant prolonged life, hung in a garden at the world's western edge, tended by maidens and guarded by a dragon or a serpentine beast, depending on the teller. Heracles' approach varied by account. In one, he persuades Atlas, the great bearer of the heavens, to fetch the apples while he shoulders the sky. In another, he sneaks or fights and carries them away. The garden, however, is always depicted as a place of twilight scent and golden leaves, a place that seduces with promises of comfort and longevity. In taking the apples, Heracles resists immortality's easy offering. He learns that his struggle is not to hoard life, but to earn the peace that might one day be granted. Scholarly aside, the motif of a Western garden appears in many cultures as a symbol of the unreachable or the eternal. The Hesperides are part of that long line of images that made the West a place of wistful longing in the ancient mind. And finally, the descent to the underworld. Cerberus, the three-headed hound that kept watch at Hades' gate, was the last and weightiest labor. The underworld in these myths is not only a place of horror, it is an ordered realm of shadows, rites, and a strict law. Heracles asked permission of Hades, and through a mixture of words and strength, he led Cerberus up into the light,
not to kill the creature, but to show the king of the living that he could move through the darkest rooms and back again. When the task was done and the beast returned to its post, the world seemed to breathe a small, relieved breath. The descent and return stand for a lesson older than any. Knowledge of death's rooms need not be final when the return is made with respect. Between these 12 scenes, the narrative often pauses to let the listener sink into reflection.
Each labor is not merely a spectacle, it is a different way to face a night's trouble. The lion is what you meet in your bed, fear so close you can feel its breath. The hydra is the repeating worry that sprouts new heads when you trim one down. The stables are the mess you inherit. The apples tempt you toward shortcuts. In this way, the myth becomes a map for nightly anxieties. One can approach them, manage them, and in time put them aside. Lullaby passage. Consider your own small room now. The pillow slightly indented where your head rests. The hum of distant life. Let each labor be a small lesson you tuck into a pocket. You do not have to carry them all at once. Rest asks you to set some down. After the labors, Hercules did not become merely a hero inscribed in stone. He wandered in ways both tender and odd. He rescued Prometheus from his long chain, a small act of rebellion against the cruelty of gods. Prometheus's gift to men, fire, had always made him both friend and enemy to a mortal order, and Heracles' release of him is a brotherly answer. In freeing Prometheus, the hero performs a kindness that is neither loud nor applauded in the world's songs. It is a private mending, a promise kept to a fellow sufferer. There are lighter episodes, too. In Lydia, tradition holds that he took service in a foreign court to learn restraint. He was at times sold into a kind of servitude and learned the humility of paying back what life had given him in small, everyday acts of work. In another sequence of tales, he joins the Argonauts for a spell, a cameo, as it were, where his size and humor make him both valuable and distracted. In each of these smaller stories, he displays human contradictions. A man who can lift a pillar and yet is often laughed at for missing a joke. Enormous tenderness paired with a stubbornness that can bruise. Cultural vignettes. A Roman wall fresco shows him sharing bread with a household slave. A Hellenistic mosaic presents his foot stepping into the sea at the dawn of a long voyage. These images depict a traveler who, despite his renown, keeps his hands open to daily bread. There is a quiet charm in the tale of his time with Philoctetes, or in the story where he founds a city and plants a grove. He builds temples in little places, draws boundaries that will become towns, and leaves names in the chalk and salt that future generations will whisper when they hunt apple harvests or bind a stag. The myth suggests that foundation is a kind of labor, and that making a place to rest is as heroic as any battle. Lullaby passage. Imagine a small settlement at evening, lights blinking like a distant cluster of fireflies. Families sit at doors, the smell of stew rises, and a man with a big history palms a loaf and passes it down a table. Let your thoughts lay along that table, flat and satisfied. His romantic life, as the older tales narrate, is complex and often accidental, full of warmth and clumsy errors.
Deianira enters his story as a woman who loves him and fears losing him. Her tenderness is not framed as villainy. Rather, in the most human of ways, her actions come from anxious devotion. The episode with Nessus, the centaur who ferries travelers across a river, is one of those moments where misjudgment and deception meet need and trust. Nessus, who is both liar and wounded creature in differing versions, offers Deianira a centaur's blood wrapped in a promise that it will keep Heracles faithful. It is a gift spoken of in a smaller voice in the narratives, a token of love that will prove to be the story's slow-burning mistake. When Deianira later trusts this talisman, believing it a balm, the results are tragic in their quietness rather than in spectacle. Heracles dons a shirt spattered with potion. It clings and pains, and he understands in the ebbing moments that he has been betrayed not by malice, but by a loving mistake. The scenes of his suffering are described with restraint, the decline of a great man into a fever of sorrow, the knowledge of what cannot be undone. He builds his own funeral pyre, asking friends to help, asking for a final gesture of release. In that act there is a double mercy, for him a letting go, for those who love him a rite that turns grief into something shared. The pyre itself, in the versions that speak gently of such things, becomes a place of release rather than a tableau of horror. His mortal pains are offered upward like a breath exhaled, and in many tellings he is raised to Olympus, apotheosis, where the gods receive him as one cleansed and remade. There, in the final scenes, Hera's long anger is transformed into acceptance. Some speak of her last-minute tenderness as a reconciliation of mythic scale. Others see it as a softening that says, even wrongs carried for ages can, in time, find a small end. He is united to Hebe, goddess of youth, not as a prize, but as a sign that toil yields rest and restoration in mythic imagination. Artworks keep this ascension tender. A number of classical reliefs show a figure rising, not as a violent eruption into light, but like a sleep deepening into dream. His outstretched hand meets another, and the grapes of immortality, small and golden, are set before him. The images comfort because they translate loss into a place of belonging. Meditative lyrical passage. Turn inward for a breath. Consider the many ways we carry weight, work left undone, words unsaid, an aching in the body that will not stop at day's end. Imagine placing each of these cares on a small boat and allowing them to float down a river at dusk. The current is steady. Your hand opens. You are not required to row them away, only to let them go. In the centuries that followed, cultures folded Hercules into their own languages like a useful tool. The Romans, who renamed him Hercules, did not so much change him as translate him into a new register.
He became a guardian in towns, a figure used on coins to suggest strength and civic virtue, a hero whose image hung in baths and in garlands above doors. Philosophers, Stoics among them, read him as a model of endurance, a man who worked through fate to shape his soul. Pain was not frivolous, it was material to be finished. The Stoics admired the way he bore what life gave and translated it into moral maturity. Cultural vignette. In a Roman mosaic, Hercules is shown lifting a giant rock, his face not triumphant, but calmly focused, a suggestion that labor is a form of meditation. In the East, where Hellenistic influence touched Gandhara and farther reaches, he appeared in sculptural forms that married Greek anatomy with local dress. Statues from that region show a man who could be Buddha-like in his serenity, an unexpected but peaceful echo. The myth's reach is a slow thing. It sits in stones and shrines, in the palimpsest of human story-making. Another lullaby paragraph. Think of the sound made by hands rubbing oil into wood. The motion is small, repetitive, and produces a quiet luster. Each circle on the grain is a small repair. Let your breath move in simple circles, and imagine each one polishing you a little more toward rest. There are tinctures of comedy sprinkled through the mythos. One is the story where, captured by Queen Omphale to wear a woman's garments and spin at a distaff, Heracles learns the humility of doing what is asked, even when others expect him to be unbending. He spins and laughs, learning that strength may include performing small domestic labors. These lighter vignettes remind us he was not one-dimensional. He could both lift a pillar and mend a hem. Prometheus's rescue, once more, continues to speak softly here. The tale frames Heracles as a deliverer who understands pain in other shapes. His rescue is less about his own glory than about restoring a wrong. In this action, he shows what one does when one has seen too much suffering to ignore it. Art vignette. A relief and an Alexandrian workshop shows Heracles unshackling Prometheus. Both men stooped with effort. The lines of the stone are tender in their weariness. As the story bends toward its close, the scene at Deianira's hand repeats itself as both parable and pathos. Nessus, an agent of flawed counsel, crosses the stream and leaves words that are remembered like a half-remembered fever. Deianira believes she acts for love and unwittingly sets a tragic chain into motion. The narrative treats her gently, not as villain but as human being whose fear for love becomes the agent of loss. The hurt is described in terms of misunderstanding and sorrow. Heracles' awareness of betrayal is interior. He knows not a single instant of rage, but a long, painful realization that what she offered him was not balm, but bind.
Her final scenes are accompanied by friends, Philoctetes, who lights the pyre, sometimes by act, sometimes by accident, and the chorus of those who have loved and been loved by him. His death is a complex weave of agency and surrender. The pyre is set. The smoke rises not as a furious pillar, but but as soft steam. In the moment of ascent, myth chooses to cross the line from mortal story to mythic archetype. The man who labored moves into the realm where labor is no longer necessary, where rest is not a scarcity but a given. There is, in many tellings, a last gesture of reconciliation. Hera steps forward with gifts and with a peace that the young gods had not offered earlier. It is not trivial. It is a narrative closing that says, time wears down even divine wrath. In the end, she gives him a place in Olympus, and in some versions, a final wedding to Hebe, goddess of youth. The image is of an old man, by our count, made new again, his weapons set aside, his hands cupped for offering rather than grasping. Final lullaby passage. Picture an evening sky, streaked with soft pale clouds. A star appears, then another. Each light is a place where a story rests. Let your eyes imagine the quiet web of these lights, and let your heartbeat slow to match their steady blinking. The legacy that followed is long and diverse. Artists of the Renaissance took up Hercules again and again, painting and carving him in gestures that balance muscle and mercy. Michelangelo, among others, used his body language to explore the human figure as something both strong and vulnerable. Later, in the modern world, his name became shorthand, Herculean, for great effort, a linguistic token that everyone could apply to a heavy day's work. Cultural vignette. A 17th century tapestry in a European manner shows Hercules as both gardener and guardian, bending toward vines and shielding a sleeping child, an image of the hero domesticated and comfortable. Stoic writers told his story as an exemplar. Face what is given, perform the duty before you, and measure the soul by its capacity for repeated action. These philosophers did not idealize him as perfect. They admired him for his work ethic and his capacity to accept fate's hard edges. The moral drawn is not that suffering is good, but that courage in the face of repetition is a kind of craft. A final reflective lyric. Consider how many things in your life look like labors. Not dragons, perhaps, but the washing of plates, the calls you must make, the small griefs you carry to bed. The myth insists these are not small or meaningless. They are the wood you stack for your own quiet pyre, preparations for a rest that you earn through patience. Let that thought soften your chest. You have done enough for one day. As the last stones of Heracles' mortal life settle into myth, the story returns to us as a means to hush. It is not a promise that our labors will be resolved in spectacular conversion.
It is a comfort that persistence holds its own reward, the permission to sleep. Whether the night's burden is guilt, worry, or simply tiredness, there is in this old tale a map. Meet the thing that needs meeting. Learn which problems require cleverness rather than force. Accept help, and find small acts of service that change the current. One final cultural note. Across the Mediterranean, from Ephesus to Rome, from Alexandria to rural Anatolia, images of Hercules were placed at thresholds to encourage visitors to enter with courage. In some places, his statue stood by the baths, where men and women came to shed the day's grime and rest. In others, he became a character in moral plays, a figure recited in lullabies to teach endurance to young boys. These are small markers of how a myth becomes part of nightly life, not commanding sleep, but gathering people around the common idea that the night is a small partner to any day's labor. If this long telling has brought you any ease, there are more such tales gathered in a playlist that follows this voice and its quiet steps. Consider subscribing if you would like another story to keep company with your night. No obligation, only an invitation to more gentle hours. Now imagine the road he walked for the last time, the weight of his arms set down, the soft dusk wind reading his name into the grass. Imagine a simple bed, linen smoothed, the slow method of covering oneself like a small rite. Breathe in, long, and out, longer. Let the myth sit beside you like a warm cloak, the lion skin turned now into an emblem of rest. Sleep well, hero.